Hi again then guys, and welcome to yet another specific car review for Gran Turismo Sport in particular, and this time we are actually returning, in a sense, to a car which I planned to review before the 1.11 patch with all of the associated cars actually dropped. This was literally pretty much the same day that I was planning to review this car, but of course those cars were more important, so we bumped it back. Now, the car in question is one which you immediately have a certain mindset when you go into, because expectations are there from the brand, from the car, from its motorsport legacy and history, in the same way as you'd expect from a Mitsubishi Evo, or to some degree others too, Lancia Delta, Ford Focus perhaps, but in particular the Evo and the Impreza are cars with incredible historical significance when it comes to rallying, despite the fact that they haven't been rallying really as long ago as many other rally cars like the Audi Quattro, for instance, were. Those cars are classics among the rally world, something like a Stratos or the aforementioned Delta. The Evo and the Impreza in comparison almost feel like kind of young bucks, although they have been around for over 2 decades now, so they're not young, but they still kind of seem it, or at least for me. Now this car takes the rallying experience of an Impreza in the world of Gran Turismo, specifically to a whole new level, one which we haven't really experienced before, because we've never had something like a Gr.B Subaru or a Pikes Peak Subaru, or even something like a Rallycross spec Subaru, something which goes beyond a WRC car, because that's what we've already always had. We had the prototype, we had the first generation 22B style WRC car, we had the newer shape, we had some fictional ones, some real ones. This one is a whole different level, because most of those cars tend to always have somewhere in the region of about 300 to 320 horsepower. They perform in a fairly similar way. Of course the handling changes, but you know what you're going to get. Just like, as I said with the Evo, you know what you're going to get. But now, with Gran Turismo Sport and their inclusion of Gr.B style machines, or more specifically modern interpretations of Gr.B machines, the tables have totally turned, changed, however you want to term it, for both the Evo and the Impreza, because they're both on a whole different level. These modern Gr.B cars already put out similar kind of power levels to what the WRC cars have on Gran Turismo 6, for instance, when you fully upgrade them. Those cars put out 550, 560 horsepower. This one's got 521 already. 441 pound-feet of torque, and it weighs less than most of the WRC cars on that game. For instance, the hatchback-style WRX weighs around 1,315 kilos, or thereabouts. This one weighs 1,280, so not only is it far more powerful, but it's lighter as well. The horsepower per tonne is already over 400 straight out of the box, and then you add that on top of the fact that you're already expecting greatness from both the Evo and the Impreza, because that precedent has been set, both in the game and in the real world. It's one of the relatively few occasions where you can genuinely understand why a car would be OP in a game, in the case of both the Evo and the Impreza on many games, not just Gran Turismo. For rallying, that's justified, because they're almost OP in real life as well. They're so good. They didn't necessarily win everything, but they won a lot, let's just say. Now, with that in mind, how does this car compare? Because unlike a lot of other rally cars, like the Peugeot RCZ Gr.B, we have things to compare them to. It's not an unprecedented thing. It's just a whole new level. Well, with that in mind, I would say that the Subaru and the Evo are almost at a slight disadvantage, funnily enough, because people expect so much that it could be potentially harder to please them. Maybe even be a little underwhelming. Now for me personally, I don't love the Impreza. I have a huge amount of respect for it, but I've always been more of an Evo fan. With that in mind, I don't actually love the Evo or the Impreza of the Gr.B category. I tend to go more for the left field choices like the Peugeot, because they're just not as obvious. Very popular, but not as obvious. Certainly not as realistic and not as long-standing a legacy. In the case of this car though, I do feel that it's still a little bit more forgiving than the Evo is, which is basically the way it's always been. The Evo is a sharper car which feels almost faster, whereas the Impreza is more of a thumpier car. Of Of course, the engine helps with that, which is a little bit softer for handling, but still very competitive. That is definitely retained on this car. It still feels that way, but with a wider track, a lot more power, a lot more torque. So in a way, it actually kind of handles like a fully tuned WRC car did on Gran Turismo 6, but with updated physics and a much wider body kit, which in itself, people often don't think of what kind of a difference that can make, but having a much wider track, making the car in effect like a couple of feet wider, that can make a huge difference to how a car handles. The Nissan GT-R, for instance, the R35 is a perfect example. It's very fast, but it's also very big. So when you turn it into, for instance, a Super GT race car, you're making it even bigger, it's even wider, taking up more space. So for something like these, where you're making the car wider, they simply do take up more space on the track, and one of the great things about both the Evo and the Impreza was always how nimble they were, especially for their size, because they're not the smallest of rally cars, being based on four-door sedans rather than hatchbacks. So are you going to negate that for the sake of less body roll, which of course is one of the main advantages of a wider track? It also allows you to lower the centre of gravity, potentially even chop the body of the car itself like a Super GT, to once again get that weight lower. Well, yes and no, because it is a fact, and it's not down to personal opinion, it is a fact. The car is bigger, it's wider, just like all of them are. But, for me personally, one of the differences between the Impreza and the Evo is that I think the Impreza actually handles that increase in size better than the Evo does. The Evo feels good, but it doesn't, to me at least, feel great, whereas this one feels significantly improved compared to just a fully tuned WRC car. Now, I said that the performance is similar, which it is, but the handling is not, because the handling by definition can't be the same, it's a wider car, as we've said. So I would say that overall this car is basically what you'd expect an Impreza with over 500 horsepower to be, but also a little bit more on top. It's not, however, one of the most exciting choices of rally car, and that's something which I've always felt about both the Evo and the Impreza, that they get the job done, but just like the Nissan GT-R, they do it in what I would call a fairly clinical way. They have their fans, for good reason, but they're not the most passionate of cars. And I know there are people who would disagree with that, but for me personally, they do feel more like vehicles which are mathematical to me. They are designed to go fast and to win, but there's not as much passion there as with something like, for instance, the Peugeot, or a Stratos, or a Delta, or a Quattro. But maybe that's just me. But either way, that's it for this review. It is a very strong rally car and it will serve you well. And that's it for this pick. So of course, I'll see you guys next time. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.